She turned the page of her book. Her eyes wandered through the words and sentences. She turned the page again. Suddenly, an extremely unpleasant smell filled her nose, making her look up. There was a boy leaning on another tree in front of her. He was smoking and blowing large puffs towards her. "Hey," she said, "can you not blow the smoke towards me, please?" Their eyes locked, but then he looked away. She watched him exhale to the side, doing as she requested. A smile took place on her face. "Thanks." She waited for a reply, but he merely nodded without so much as a glance at her. His silence was somewhat respected by her. After all, words were such a waste. Sighing, she returned her gaze to the book, but she had already lost interest due to the recent distraction. "I'll continue tomorrow," she thought. As she stood, she eyed the boy. He looked young, about her age or a year older. Even though she wouldn't admit it, he was very handsome, but in her opinion, smokers were less attractive. Nonetheless, he had been kind to her when she asked him to blow his smoke away from her, so she decided to repay him with kindness back. "Thanks again. Have a good afternoon." She didn't expect a reply this time. With a small smile, she walked away with her book in hand. Next day, she sat down by the tree and took in her surroundings. It was bright and quiet, exactly the way she liked it for a nice afternoon reading. "I'll finish much more today," she murmured as she opened up her book. Her eyes jumped from word to word and made theories in her mind. But then, that stench once again filled her nose and she looked up. She wasn't surprised by the boy's presence. "Hello again," she greeted him. He sat in front of her like yesterday and gazed at the girl for a moment. Then, he nodded curtly and blew out a puff of smoke to the side. For some reason, she smiled. "Thanks for remembering to, blow the smoke away from me." She looked back at her book, completely embarrassed, and turned the page. Then another and another. Her eyes roamed over the words until she had about 32 chapters left. She calculated how many days it would take to complete them. 2 days. "That's not so bad," she thought. "I would finish it by... Wait, what day is it again?" She patted her jean pocket and sighed. It wasn't the first time she had forgotten her phone. Excuse me." She cleared her throat as she regarded him with a small smile. "Sorry to bother you, but do you know what day of the week it is?" He gave her a calm, neutral look before holding up 4 fingers. "Wait, so it's the 4th day of the week?" He nodded. "It's Wednesday then." He nodded. She smiled. "Great, thanks." He nodded. She chuckled as she wondered if his neck ever hurt from nodding so often. Or was he silent only with her? Closing her book, she quickly shook the thought away and looked up at the sky. It was getting late. She hadn't realized how long it had been. "Well, have a good evening." She smiled at him before walking away. But she couldn't help looking back. She was surprised to see him walking away also, in the opposite direction. She was confused too. Yesterday, he didn't leave as soon as she did. What was different today? It was raining, not the shower kind, but the thunderstorm kind. And there's only one difference between rainy days and sunny days to her. It's that for one of them, you need an umbrella. So there she was, sitting alone by the tree with a book and an umbrella protecting her. But she didn't seem to mind the rain. After all, without rain, there wouldn't be rainbows. She obviously wasn't expecting anyone else outside. Not many people liked the rain, sadly. But after a few minutes, the boy was sitting in front of her once again, with no umbrella, no raincoat, or even a hoodie. Yet he remembered to bring his cigarettes, which were currently in use. "Hey, what are you doing here without an umbrella?" she asked him. He shrugged. "You should stay indoors unless you'd like to take a rain shower." He shrugged. She stared at the million drops that fell on him as he smoked carelessly. Sighing, she closed her book and stood up. He watched her every movement as she sat down beside him. Her umbrella was big enough to cover both of them. "There! If you're gonna stay, we might as well share my umbrella," she said, and he slowly nodded. His cigarette was constantly releasing smoke into the air, making her cough. That caught his attention. She eyed him as he crushed his cigarette with his hand and stuffed it in his pocket. Perplexed, she murmured, Thanks. You didn't have to do that." He shrugged. Strangely, she began to feel warmth by his silence. He didn't need words to explain himself. Simple gestures or actions were explanatory enough. She smiled as she opened her book again. but it was quite difficult to turn the pages and hold the umbrella at the same time. He noticed her difficulty and held the umbrella for her, without a word. Her face softened, grateful for his help. "Thanks." She realized how often she thanked him and felt a bit sheepish. However, he didn't seem to mind. They continued to sit beside each other, and he continued to hold the umbrella for about half an hour, but she knew she had to leave. She couldn't stay there all day and night, much to her disappointment. So she closed her book and turned to him. He was looking around aimlessly, and he didn't look like he was enjoying it. It made her wonder why he was even there. People don't usually go to the park when it's raining or go outside at all during this type of weather. Does he like rain too? "Well, I have to get going. Have a nice night," she told him as she stood. After a few seconds, he rose and handed over her umbrella. The girl smiled at him. "Thank you. Remember to bring an umbrella next time, okay?" She swore she saw the corner of his lip lift for a quick second. He nodded at her, and she took that as her cue to leave. But as she walked away, she glanced back and saw him walking in the opposite direction. Again, why didn't he leave before? It was another day, but it felt the same to her. He was sitting in front of her. She was sitting with her book. He continued to smoke. She continued to smile. Yesterday, during the rain, she felt like she had gotten closer to the boy. And quite frankly, she was happy about it. She thought it was stupid. How could he, the mysterious boy who never spoke a word, make her happy? It honestly confused her. But what could she do? Not many things made her happy, so if he did, she planned on holding on to him. She froze suddenly. Her heart was beating rapidly. Her mind was swirling uncontrollably. All because he was looking at her, looking directly into her eyes, staring, gazing, searching. He never truly looked at her before. Maybe the occasional glance, but definitely nothing like this. The way he looked at her was so captivating. She was trapped, and she didn't want to escape. That is, until smoke was blown onto her face and she began coughing. Her book fell to the side as she covered her mouth with her arm. She lifted her eyes up to him. "Why'd you do that?" He blinked, and she lost hope that he would finally speak. Truthfully, she was anxious for him to speak. She wanted to hear his voice. Quite often she pondered how his voice sounded, but nothing ever stuck in her mind. "Fine," she huffed. "Don't answer me. Just don't smoke towards me again." Frustrated, she grabbed her book and flipped to her page. Then, suddenly, it wasn't like any other day. "What are you doing?" he asked. She was in shock. He finally spoke. His voice wasn't what she predicted at all. It was rough and low while she suspected it to be raspy since he was a smoker. I'm reading," she responded, and he shook his head. "No, you're not." He glanced at her book before looking back up at her. "You're skimming." Her eyebrows furrowed. "How do you know that?" "Your eyes," he said curtly. "Why do you skim?" Because I like to get a peek before I start reading." He quirked an eyebrow at her. "Doesn't that ruin the story?" "Not really," she shrugged. He watched her fidget with her hands. "Are you uncomfortable?" She gaped at his bluntness. No." "Then why are you fidgeting?" he questioned, and she hid her hands away from him. "Habit," she said, nodding at his cigarette. "Like you smoking." He pursed his lips. "It's an addiction." "Right, sorry." "Don't be." For a moment, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She realized she had lots of questions for him. Why didn't he ever speak? Why did he smoke? Why did he only leave after she did? Why did he sit in front of her every day doing nothing except smoke? But instead, she asked him, "What's your name?" His eyes shot up to hers. She eagerly waited for his answer. He hesitated. "You can call me Sig." "Sig?" she repeated. "As in cigarette?" "It's a nickname." "So, people call you that?" "No," he said. "You're the only one." That brought a smile to her face. "Okay, and you can call me Rainy." "Rainy." "Sig." For the first time, she was excited for all the other days to come. Now, so was Sig. She waited patiently for him. Her book was in her hands, open but unimportant at the moment. Finally, she caught sight of his tall figure and quickly returned her attention back to her book. He was walking towards her, looking around aimlessly. It was as if she could feel his presence, which made her giddy inside. When he sat down in front of her, she fought the temptation of looking at him. She wasn't sure if he felt comfortable talking to her again, so she waited for him to make the first move. But she wasn't as patient as she was before. Her heart hammered in her chest as smoke engulfed her. His smoke. He was trying to get her attention. "Oh, hey, Sig," she said casually. The corner of his lips curled slightly, and his eyes glowed with amusement. It didn't help her heartbeat slow at all. "Hey, Rainey." She couldn't stop the grin from forming on her face. "Do you mind blowing your smoke away from me?" And he couldn't stop his eyes from shining brightly at her. "Certainly. Thanks. No problem." It was a short conversation they had, but it was definitely worth something. When the sun was replaced by the moon, she stood and smiled down at him. He stared at her with the most beautiful blue eyes she's ever seen. His blue eyes were adored by her, while her smile was adored by him. Neither of them noticed how much admiration they had for each other. Maybe that was the reason they always kept quiet, to simply admire each other in peaceful silence. It was somewhat comforting. "Well, bye, Sig." He gave her a small smile. "Bye, Rainey." She paused, nervous. "I'll see you tomorrow?" The hopeful tone in her voice didn't go unnoticed by him. "Always," he promised. That was all she needed to hear before walking back home. After looking back at him leaving too, of course. Too bad she couldn't see the soft smile on his face. Smoke was once again blown onto her face. She smiled up at him. "Hey, Sig." "Hey, Rainey." He stared at her for a while, which made her wonder what he was thinking, and she couldn't help but think, did he think she was pretty? Of course, she knew she wasn't the most beautiful girl in the world, but she wouldn't call herself ugly either. She liked to think of herself as average. In his eyes, though, she was incredibly beautiful. "So," he gestured toward her book. "Are you finished skimming yet?" She looked down at her book and shrugged. "Not entirely. I think I'll just start reading already." Well, when you're finished, you can tell me how it ends." "Deal," she grinned. He gave her a small smile before leaning his head back on the tree, closing his eyes. Taking advantage of the moment, she let herself look at him. He had long, jet black hair that fell over his forehead. His jaw was sharp and made his face look very masculine. Along with broad shoulders, he also had a prominent Adam's apple that was currently bobbing. Since his sleeves were rolled up, the veins in his arms were visible from his biceps to his knuckles. His legs were long but structured. Overall, he was quite attractive. She cleared her throat, returning her attention back to her book. She began reading the first chapter and became so transfixed by the book, she didn't notice him staring at her. His eyes trailed down to her long, dark, dirty blonde hair to her legs. She, he thought, was the most gorgeous person he had ever laid eyes on. Her sharp collarbones, her sleek hair, her little hands, her tanned skin, her adorable face, and her full lips. He couldn't imagine anyone more stunning than her. And as she read, he smiled at her concentrated expression. Everything about her made his heart skip a beat. She made him happy without even knowing it. Because of that, he couldn't let her go. He never wanted to let her go. It was very cloudy. She was having trouble reading in the dark. Luckily, she had remembered her phone and used its flashlight. "It's pretty dark today, huh?" "Yeah, it is," she responded, slightly surprised he didn't blow the smoke onto her face like every other day. He looked down, biting his lip. I was reading this article last night." "Oh?" She leaned forward. "What was it about?" "It was about this thing called second-hand smoke," he muttered, sounding guilty. "Oh. Yeah, it said it could cause lung cancer even to non-smokers." She nodded. "Wow, I never knew that." "Me neither. But now that I do, I want to say sorry to you," he said, and an involuntary smile spread across her face. "Why are you sorry?" "Well," he frowned, "I've been blowing my smoke right at your face. I don't want you to get lung cancer because of me." He quickly added, "Or get it at all." She couldn't help but smile even wider. His expression was so worried, so sheepish and so full of regret. But the fact that he felt that way made her feel happy inside because he cared about her. "I forgive you, Sig," she said softly. "I'll always forgive you." Simple words she spoke, words that meant the world to him. That's all he wanted, her forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, he'll want more one day. For now, though, he was satisfied. The smile on his face did not go unnoticed by her, and neither did hers by him, but the sweet moment was cut short. "Oh no," she groaned. "What is it?" Look. She showed her phone to him. It ran out of battery. He furrowed his eyebrows as he looked at her phone, then at her. He repeated the movements at least 3 times before his eyes widened in understanding. Slowly, he stood. "What are you doing?" "Sitting beside you," he responded, and plopped down next to her. "Yes," she nodded. "I see that. But why?" He reached into his pocket and smiled at her. "You want to read your book, don't you?" "Preferably, yes. But it's dark, and you can't use your phone as a flashlight because it's dead." She narrowed her eyes at him. "Yeah, this is where I come in." He paused, staring at her. "But first I need to fix this." "Fix what?" Her mouth closed abruptly, and she froze. His hand was gently pulling her hair back. The slightest brush of his fingers made her shiver and her heartbeat quicken. "There," he whispered. Before pulling away from her, his fingers lingered on the side of her cheek. He admired her soft, warm skin. She admired his hard, cold skin. Clearing his throat, he opened his left hand and she murmured in realization. The flame lit up his face, which made her heart skip a beat. He made sure to be extra careful when he held the lighter over her book. "You better not light my book on fire, Sig," she muttered, trying to decrease the intensity of the moment. The both of them put on calm facades, but their hearts were still pounding. He gave her a mischievous smile. "I won't. Your book is safe, but you are a different story." "Hey!" She shouldered him playfully. "Don't you dare!" All right. Chill, Rainey." She narrowed her eyes at him as he chuckled. After a few minutes of playful glares and cheeky grins, they became comfortable with each other. It was as if they were old friends, their connection unwavering. He yawned quietly, which made her look at him. "If you're tired, Sig, you can go home." No, I'm good. You keep on reading," he told her, but she shook her head. "Sig, you're tired. Come on," she insisted. He was incredibly stubborn. "I'm fine, Rainey. You're not even done reading that chapter." "Oh, forget about the book." She sighed and rose to her feet. She stuck out her hand, staring at him patiently. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you expect me to do?" Rolling her eyes, she grabbed his hand and pulled him up. He was shocked by her strength. How could someone be almost as thin as a stick and have that much strength? "Now go home." "What am I? A dog?" he replied. She couldn't help smiling at that. "No, you aren't. May you please go home now, Sig?" "Better," he nodded. "But I'm still not leaving." "Okay, fine. Stay here in the dark all alone. I'm going home." She turned and began to walk towards her neighborhood. After a minute or two, she heard him walking in the other direction. Smiling, she looked back and shouted, "Night, Sig! Sleep tight!" She wasn't expecting a response, but when he shouted back, it certainly made her happy. "Good night, Rainey. I'll see you tomorrow." Tomorrow never sounded so good. Today was most likely the hottest day of the month. "Sig, I'm going to melt!" she shouted dramatically, setting her book to the side. He gave her a cool look. "Are you now?" "Yes, I am," she wiped her forehead. "Or I'm going to die of a heat stroke. Neither of them end well." "Agreed." Sighing, she looked over at him and gasped. "How are you just sitting there? Do you even feel this heat?" "I do, but I'm not as affected by it as you," he shrugged. "Teach me your ways," she groaned, which made him chuckle. "Sig, if I melt, could you put me in a jar and freeze me?" He raised an eyebrow at her. "Okay, and what would I do with your frozen remains?" "Put it in your room, somewhere you would be able to see me every day. That way, you'd never forget about me." "Forget about the girl who melted and asked me to freeze her in a jar. That's pretty unforgettable, Rainey," he grinned when she laughed. But he knew she was unforgettable either way. She was one of a kind, and he didn't ever want to forget her pretty personality or her pretty face. "Do you promise to do that if I melt?" "I don't know," he teased her. She pouted. "Please? I would do the same for you." "Would you? Really? Oh, how generous of you," he said sarcastically, and she moved closer to him. "Pretty please?" She gave him the puppy dog eyes. "Pretty, please?" Every time she said pretty made him think of her. It was frustrating for him because he couldn't take his eyes off of her. "Fine. I promise I'll freeze your remains and keep them in my room." "Thank you, Sig. You're so nice." She poked his arm playfully. Jolts ran through his arm and his body as she smiled at him. He cleared his throat, nodding. "No problem." "Ah," she sighed. "I feel relieved. Now I can melt in peace." A chuckle escaped from him, which made her smile even wider. He made her heart go places she never went before with anyone, and she made him feel things he had never felt before with anyone. Overall, they made each other happy. Sweet happiness was what they had. What more could they ask for? Ice cream! The famous tune of the ice cream truck sounded through the park. She jumped excitedly and reached in her pockets for money. Different. That was the word that would describe today. Different. The air between them had shifted, but not in a bad way. Both of them could feel it as they stole glances at each other. They obviously weren't complete strangers anymore. They weren't acquaintances either, so what were they? Friends? Best friends? Or maybe they didn't have any kind of friendship at all. Perhaps they had more of a relationship. So, she cleared her throat awkwardly. How are you today, Sig? He was silent for a minute, unsure of how to respond. I'm okay. How are you? I'm good. That's good, he nodded. She bit her lip as she stared down at her book. There was only about 5 chapters left, but by the looks of it, she wouldn't be reading anything at the moment. Sighing, he stood and looked down at her. Shall we? What? She furrowed her eyebrows. Where are we going? I don't know. How about the swings? Alrighty then, she chuckled, and he helped her up. As they walked to the swings together, she felt her hand twitch, inching towards his. He craved for her touch, so when she reached for his hand, a jolt of joy spread over him. They squeezed each other's hands and smiled. His hand was big, rough, while hers was small, soft, but he made her feel protected and confident, and she made him feel comforted and cared for. Without letting go of each other, they sat on the swings, and he moved closer to her. The park was mostly empty, except for a few families roaming around. I haven't been here in a while, he murmured. In a long while. She looked up at him, interested. Yeah? Why not? I had no reason to be here, he shrugged. Oh. But now I do. He smiled at her, and she ducked her head, trying to hide her blush. He gazed at their conjoined hands, his heart fluttering. You know, Rainey, I haven't really told you this, but I really appreciate you. I really appreciate you too, Sig, she grinned. And I want you to know that I'm extremely grateful that you're in my life. I would never hurt you in any kind of way, and thank you for being there for me every day. Her heart was about ready to jump out of its cage and into his arms. Never in her entire life had she heard someone say that to her, or look at her the way he did. Happy. She felt amazingly happy. It was such a beautiful word, she realized. Happy. The wide grin on her face wouldn't falter as she stared at him. He tried reading her expression, but there were so many emotions swirling in her eyes. But none of them were bad. There were no words to express her feelings, so she turned to actions. She stood, and as soon as she opened her arms, he knew what she wanted. He pulled her into a hug and leaned on the metal frame that held up the swings. Breathing in his scent once again, she closed her eyes and let herself lean into him. She let herself trust him. Her hair had the sweetest smell in the world, and he couldn't get enough of it. He held her tightly and laid his head on hers. Why couldn't they stay that way forever, in each other's embrace? They both wondered that when they pulled away, but their hands remained together. She sat back down on the swings, which made him think of an idea. Grinning, he went behind her and began to push the swings lightly. Soon enough, she was high up in the air and her laughter vibrated in his ears. It was so contagious, her laugh, that he couldn't help joining in. Come on, swing with me, Sig, she yelled happily. He pushed her one last time before sitting in the swing beside her, and he gradually got higher and higher as he swayed his feet. Finally, they were high in the skies and low on the ground together. They laughed their hearts out, smiled until their cheeks were sore, gazed at each other as much as possible before each blink. Most of all, they were happy, simply happy. She stared at him as he walked over to her. Hey, she furrowed her eyebrows, concerned. What's wrong? He groaned softly when he sat down across from her. Nothing, why? You're limping. I sprained my ankle, he shrugged nonchalantly. You should get some type of cast or wrap something around it, she suggested, but he shook his head. I'm okay, Rainey. Thank you, though. She bit her lip, noticing his slight discomfort. Are you sure? I could help, if... Rainey, he cut her off and reached for her hand. I'm okay. Okay, she whispered as he rubbed circles on her hand. Sighing, she looked up at him and smiled. That smile that he couldn't resist. Before he could stop himself, he said, "You have the most beautiful smile in the world." They both froze. His heart hammered and his breathing became shallow. Her heart hammered and her breathing became shallow. He was afraid of her reaction and her thoughts, but she was only afraid of the emotions, the feelings blooming and what would become of them. And they both asked themselves, what now? Just as he began to regret his actions, she gave him the biggest, happiest smile in the world, and that smile made his world. It meant the world to him. Now, even though he was no longer scared of her reaction or thoughts, he was scared of his feelings. There, on that very day, he had realized how strongly he felt about her. Never in his life had he felt this way, and he didn't think he ever would again. She was one of those people who could brighten your day with a single smile, a single word. That's all he really needed from her. A small hi and a smile. But instead, she gave him more, much more. She laughed, she held his hand, she spoke beautiful words to him, she hugged him, and she shared her happiness with him. He wasn't happy before he met her. He could admit that. He wasn't happy at all. His world was filled with darkness, and he found himself being sucked into it, with no way out. And he yearned for happiness, even if it was just a speck, just one little taste of it. But then he had sat down in that specific park, at that specific tree, specifically in front of her. On that day, his world had stopped. The darkness paused. The sadness was delayed, and he saw that little speck of happiness. She was that speck of happiness. She was his speck of happiness. She was the little bright shimmer in the middle of dark, the one he longed for, and now the one he found. As soon as she spotted him walking towards her, she shot up and put her hands behind her back. The grin on her face didn't fade. It couldn't. "Why are you looking so chipper today?" he asked when he stopped in front of her. She laughed. Chipper is such a funny word. His heart ached at the sound of her joyous laughter. Music, absolute music, the kind that gave you goosebumps and filled your mind with happiness. He smiled softly. "What's up with you, Rainey? Choose a number between 1 and 10. Random, but okay." He paused. "I choose 8. "Why that number?" She cocked her head to the side in curiosity. He blushed profusely and scratched the back of his neck. He didn't know he would have to explain. "Well, She raised an eyebrow at him. "Was it just a random number or—" "No, I chose it for a reason." He cleared his throat. "The 8, if you turn it sideways, looks like an infinity sign, and that was the first thing I thought of." "When I was looking at you," he thought to himself. "Wow, Sig, I'm impressed." She smiled at him, and he felt his heart beat faster. Oh God, that smile. Thank you," he stammered. She nodded, excited. "No problem." "Why do you ask me to choose a number?" he asked, and she shrugged. "For fun," she grinned. "Now close your eyes and give me your hands." "Excuse me?" "Oh, sorry. Close your eyes and give me your hands, please." "No, not that," he chuckled lightly. "Why do I have to close my eyes and give you my hands?" "I can't tell you," she exclaimed, as she barely held in her eagerness. He furrowed his eyebrows. "Why not? That'll ruin the surprise?" "Surprise?" His eyebrows now rose in shock. "Yes, so close your eyes and give me your hands, please." Slowly, he did as she ordered. A few seconds later, he felt something heavy in his left hand and something cold in his right hand. "Okay, now you can sit down and open your eyes," she murmured, and he nodded. He sat on the grass and looked at the items in his hand. Then he chuckled. "Really, Rainey?" This time, he was the first at their spot, but he had no problem waiting for her. She was worth the wait. He didn't have to wait much, though, because soon enough she came running towards him. Whoa, slow down, Rainey," he chuckled and stood up. She stopped in front of him and laughed breathlessly. "That was some good exercise, though." "Are you okay?" He smiled at her. "Yeah, I'm good." "Why were you running?" "I'm excited," she grinned, her hands behind her back. "Guess what happened?" He quirked an eyebrow at her. "Another guessing game?" "All right, you ate food?" "Well, yeah, food is life, but that's not what I'm talking about," she said, and he chuckled. "Then what are you talking about?" She smiled and revealed what was in her hands. "Oh, your book." He gently took it from her hands and looked over it. "Yes," she nodded. "I finished reading it." His eyes widened. "Oh, you did?" She nodded again, her smile only increasing. Well, tell me all about it," he stuttered out. "Here, let's sit down." "Okay." She sat beside him, their legs touching. He felt his hand twitch again, leaning towards hers, but he fought the need. She took a deep breath and began speaking, explaining, and he listened intently. He watched as the words rolled off her tongue and the joy that followed. He admired the passion that seemed to radiate from her. He cherished the happiness that she shared with him. His eyes never averted from her, not even once. But then, she touched his hand. Touched, physically touched. That wasn't even the best part. No, after that, she grabbed his hand and held it. She continued talking about her book, but he couldn't focus anymore. He was so astonished by her and by himself. He couldn't believe she was actually holding his hand. He couldn't believe how happy he was, so happy that he began to lean in, closer and closer, until his lips were only an inch away from her cheek. He paused, because he wasn't sure if she would be okay with it. Her eyes were open, her lips were closed, and her breathing was shallow. But then, she closed her eyes, and a smile spread across her face. There, in that moment, he knew she felt the same way as him. So he took the chance and kissed her cheek. His lips lingered on her soft skin for a second before slowly pulling away. As the moment faded, he began to feel embarrassed by such a bold move. She, on the other hand, was happy out of her mind. She did notice the uncertainty and the sheepishness in his expression. So she lightly squeezed his hand. "Sig? Yeah?" he murmured back. "Look at me." He gulped and glanced up at her. Smiling, she slowly lifted his head and held his face in her hands. Then she was the one who leaned in. She got closer and closer, until her lips were only an inch away from his cheek. But she didn't hesitate from closing the space between them. She kissed his cheek with the utmost care that she could muster. With that simple gesture, he felt his heart warm and his body felt light, like he was floating on air in complete ecstasy. She smiled and embraced him tightly. He chuckled, hugging her back. "Stay with me forever, Rainey," he whispered in her ear. "Yes," she sighed. "Forever." This was the beginning of their hearts, of their promises, of their love. The following days, they got to know each other a little better. He discovered that she had an older sister named Catherine. It was clear that they were very close, loving sisters. When he saw the happiness that spread over her face each time they spoke of her, he promised he'd meet her one day. She discovered that he was an only child, and that his mother, who he loved immensely, passed away 2 years ago. When she noticed the tears glistening in his eyes, she pulled him into a much-needed hug. They also talked about friends and how they had plenty back then, but most of them grew apart. Hobbies, movies, books, songs, singers, colors, food, idols, actors, everything was conversed between them, and they cherished each and every word. But their favorite were the memories. The both of them shared their best moments in life and their worst. Getting a driver's license, the first car crash, first relationship, first breakup, graduation, leaving childhood friends, birthdays, deaths, good memories, bad memories, all a part of who they were today, which led to the current situation. As she caught sight of his cigarette pack in his pocket, a question sparked in her mind. He was a smoker. She asked him why. He said it was his slow suicide. She sucked in a breath at the word. "Suicide?" "Yes," he whispered, avoiding eye contact. "Why?" was the only word that she could manage to say. "Because I want to let go." She stared at him with tears in her eyes. Without any warning, she embraced him. His throat clogged up and he slowly put his arms around her. All the feelings he had bottled up inside him was shared with her in that hug. As they lay on the grass, clutching to each other, they could hear their heartbeats. Their heartbeats were lined up, beating together as if they were one. He bit his lip. "Rainey?" "Yes, Sig? What would you do if I died?" he blurted, and she sighed shakily. I would cry," she whispered, as if just the thought hurt her. "Grieve, pray, hope that you were okay. But why?" She stayed silent. Then after a minute, she cupped his cheek and kissed his forehead. Her lips lingered there, her eyes closed, and a tear rolled down her cheek. On that very day, she knew she felt something more for that boy, and she knew that what she felt was going to last. "That's why," she murmured, and he smiled, closing his eyes, savoring the kiss. "Thank you." Something was different, and this time it wasn't good. He watched as she walked over to him, without the skip in her steps, without the brightness radiating off of her. "Hey, Rainey, are you okay?" he asked her, his eyebrows furrowed in worry. She nodded. "Of course." "All right," he replied with uncertainty. They sat across from each other, like always, and she gazed at nothing in particular. His eyes roamed over her figure. She was wearing her usual outfit, shorts, a tee, sneakers, and a thin jacket. Her hair was in a messy bun, no makeup added to her face. So what was different? "Find any new books yet, Rainey?" Her eyes darted over to him. "No, not yet. If you need any recommendations, I'd be glad to help," he suggested, but she shook her head. "I'm good, Sig. Thanks, though," she replied, before gazing at nothing again. Then he realized. Her smile. She hadn't smiled at all so far, and she always smiled. "Rainey?" He reached for her hand. "Yeah?" He frowned, wanting to feel her touch. "Come here, please." "Okay." She moved to his side and let him put his arms around her, their legs tangled together, his head on top of hers. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" he asked her, and she nodded slightly. "I know. Same goes for you." He softly caressed her cheek as she stared down at their intertwined hands. "Good." After a moment, she whispered, "Sig." His eyes remained closed. "Yes, Rainey. I'm tired." "I know," he said soothingly. "Go to sleep, beautiful." "Okay." She sighed and shifted closer to him. With her head on his chest, she fell asleep to the sound of his heartbeat. "Rainey!" he called. She groaned in response. He chuckled, playing with her hair. "Come on, sleeping beauty. You got to go home now." "Why?" she muttered, her voice groggy. "Because it's past 10 already. Catherine must be waiting for you." "She can wait a little longer." Her mood was still dampened. She would smile a little more, but not as much as she used to. "Rainey?" he called when he gathered up his courage. "Hmm?" He gulped nervously. "You're acting differently, Rainey. Is it because of what I said? What I said when you asked why No," she cut him off. "It's not your fault, Sig." "Then whose fault is it?" he questioned, which made her frown. "My own, Sig." "My own?" she muttered. His expression softened at her beautiful face. He understood what she meant, for he blamed himself often, but for some reason he blamed himself less these days. Since he knew what she was experiencing, he came up with a way to make her feel better. "Come on." He held her hand and led her deeper into the park. She loved his touch, his hands holding hers ever so gently. It made her feel happy inside, even when she wasn't before. He stopped in front of a very tall tree, perhaps the tallest in the park. She watched him reach for a thick branch and pull himself up to it. After taking a deep breath, he looked down at her, his blue eyes shining. "Come on, Rainey. Having fun with you definitely beats having fun by myself." He grinned at her, reaching down for her hand. A smile spread across her face, and she laughed. "Okay, Sig." Step by step they went. He kept throwing her playful smirks, which made her laugh every time. Then together they reached the top. They moved the leaves away and she gasped. "Sig!" she exclaimed, her eyes wide as she looked around. "Oh wow, you can see almost everything from up here." "Do you like it?" "That would be an understatement. I love it." Leaning into him, she sighed happily. "Thank you so much, Sig." "For what?" he mumbled. "For taking care of me." She planted a kiss on his shoulder. "For making me happy." She didn't know. How his heart just shattered. It overwhelmed him, the adoration and passion for this exquisite girl. He couldn't handle it. His heart burned, his skin prickled, his mouth dried, and his brain swirled. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what was happening. When suddenly everything stopped. He felt numb. It was like a feather slowly floating down, delicately and beautifully, until it touched the ground its destination reached. That was exactly how he could describe what happened that day. That was how he officially fell in love with Rainey, and he couldn't be any happier. The next day, things were different in his eyes. It was strange. The sky, the trees, the grass were all the exact same thing they were yesterday, but she was not. As soon as he saw her, even just a strand of her hair, it was like the whole planet brightened. He didn't understand it. Her skin was lighter and it looked softer. Her hair was shiny as if she was in a shampoo commercial. Her brown eyes reminded him of pure gold. But most of all, her smile. He fell deeper and deeper each time she smiled. He loved everything about her smile. The little dimple below her lips, her perfect teeth, the way her eyes crinkled, the way her cheeks became pink, how she closed her eyes whenever she laughed, how she tilted her head back in joy. Absolutely everything. There were no flaws in her smile, and even if there were, it wouldn't make her smile any less dazzling. So much beauty she had, yet it was only taken for granted. But he wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. "Hi, Rainey." He grinned shyly at her. "You look beautiful." He wanted to tell her how beautiful she was yesterday and all the days before that. How her beauty only seemed to increase each day. An angel, he thought, but he would save those words for another day, when he had enough courage. She blushed, his sudden compliment surprising her. Thank you." A smile spread across his face and she smiled back, and deeper in love he went. "How was your day?" he asked her as they sat across from each other. "So far, so good," she nodded. "How about you?" "Better now." Her heart began to beat a little faster. A small, nervous chuckle escaped from her lips. He couldn't help follow the movements and replay the moment in his mind. She wondered why he kept staring at her that way. It was like he was dreaming, his eyes dilated and his mouth slightly open. "Sig?" she called. Distracted, he didn't respond. Frowning, she snapped her fingers in front of his face. "Sig!" "What?" He shook his head, furrowing his eyebrows. "What's wrong?" "Were you daydreaming?" "No." His face flushed as she regarded him skeptically. "Then what were you doing?" she questioned, and he averted his eyes from her. He cleared his throat. I was thinking." "Ciao!" Sig yelled out when he saw her across the park. She looked up and grinned. "Ciao, Chig!" When she reached him, she pulled out her phone and glanced at him. "So, I searched for any Italian books in my house and it turns out I don't have any." "That's okay," he nodded. "We can check out a book from the library." "Yeah, I was thinking about that. My phone says there's a nearby library." "Oh, no need for phones, Rainey. I used to go to the library with my mom every day when I was a kid. It's only a few blocks away," he told her. "Well then, lead the way." He smiled, but before he began walking, he reached for her hand. Her cheeks became pink and she looked down. Seeing her blush made his heart flutter. He was so in love with her that at any moment he felt he would explode of happiness, and she felt things with him, things she did not understand. But she yearned to learn because she wanted to be happy. With him. "So, Rainey, how many books have you read this year?" he asked her, giving her hand a little squeeze. "Perhaps too many to count." "I think so," she laughed, and he joined her. It wasn't too hot or too cold that afternoon. It was bright and breezy, just the right weather for them. They looked around as they passed some small shops. He pointed the big things while she pointed out the small things. But they both loved everything. Their differences brought them together and caused them to see the world in a different light, in their light. To him, if there was anything perfect in the world, it was her and him, together. He led her across the road, holding her closely, before turning a corner. "Here it is." "Oh, wow." She trailed off as she gazed up at the building. "Nice, right? Nice?" she chuckled. "This is the biggest library I've ever seen." "Yeah, it's pretty old too," he nodded. She looked back down at the doors and pulled his hand. "Let's go already. Let's find our Italian books." Okay, he laughed and followed behind her. As soon as she walked in, her eyes widened and her jaw dropped. He couldn't help grinning. "Do you like it?" he questioned, and she smiled at him. "Sig, I love it. This is heaven. Jesus, it's so beautiful." "Language books are over there, but you should check out something else too. The books here are fantastic, especially the mystery books," he informed her, and she nodded. "All right, thanks, Sig. Do you want to look at the Italian books or stay with me?" She gave him a shy smile. He couldn't resist her beautiful smile. He couldn't resist her at all. For 2.5 hours they talked, recommended books for each other, discovered new books, and laughed so much. They had fun. There were moments that she would lean on him or he would hold her hand. They simply couldn't stay away from each other. "Hey, Rainey, are you in a hurry to get home today?" he asked her, holding the 3 books they checked out, but she shook her head. "Well, are you hungry? We could eat somewhere." She grinned. "Sure, have any suggestions?" He paused. "Oh, we should go to an Italian restaurant." "Yeah, where's that?" "I'm pretty sure it's right across," he pointed, and she nodded. They held hands again while they walked to the restaurant. When they got seated, he gave her a menu first before taking one for himself. She smiled kindly at him as a thank you. He cleared his throat. I think the pizza here is good. I've had it before, just the plain cheese." "Oh, I'm in the mood for pizza. Do you want to share one?" She quirked an eyebrow at him and he nodded. "Small or medium?" "I think small is fine. From the picture I see here, it's pretty big," she said. "All right, I'll order for us." He told the waiter what they would like to eat, and they each told him their drinks. The waiter nodded, smiling before walking away. "Thank you," they both called after the waiter. She faced him. "So, Sig, how are you today?" "I'm very good, thank you." "How are you, Rainey?" He leaned forward, beaming at her. "Happy," she sighed, and he put his hand over hers comfortingly. "Me too." Her eyes wandered down to their hands, and she interlaced their fingers. A smile spread across her face as she stared at their hands. Happy, she thought. Soon after they ate, they stood outside and looked at each other. He stepped closer to her, which made her heart pound. His hands found hers again while he gazed at her. She couldn't find the courage to meet his eyes. Slowly, he lifted up her chin and they locked eyes. Their hearts hammered. Her breathing hitched. His eyes searched her eyes. Then, he began to lean in, and she leaned in too. But when their lips were just centimeters apart, they stopped. Their thoughts swirled and they opened their eyes. In each other's eyes, they knew. They saw. So he closed the distance between them and softly pressed his lips against hers. His lips lingered there before pulling away. They both took deep breaths, and she looked up at him. "Sig?" He gulped. "Yes?" "Thank you," she whispered, and he nodded. "Oh, of course. Do you, want me to walk you home?" he asked her, uncertain. "Sure." She smiled at him before they walked hand in hand to her house. And the entire way, her heart fluttered with my happiness. She knew what she felt now. She understood everything. She was in love with him, and little did she know he was too. Love was in the air, and it was all because of this beautiful pair. For weeks they met each other at their spot and learned Italian together. They were all smiles at all times. He made her laugh until she cried happy tears while she made him smile until his cheeks hurt. It was impossible to ignore what they felt for each other. So they embraced it. Although they couldn't yet confess to each other, they showed their love in other ways. Through little things like the occasional hug or the unexpected hand-holding. But everything mattered, including the little things, because what created big things? Little things. What was this big thing in their case? Their love, their relationship, their everything. Them. "Rainey, when's your birthday?" he suddenly asked her. They were sitting beside each other with their Italian books spread across the grass. She glanced up, a shadow of a smile on her lips. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'd like to know. Plus, it would be pretty rude of me to not get you a present," he explained, and she bit her lip, uncertain. "Well, when is your birthday?" He cleared his throat and dramatically said, "The 16th of July, of course." She laughed at him, paying no attention to the book anymore. He grinned happily because all he wanted was to see her laugh, or be happy in general. "Well, I was born on April 2nd, she told him after she finished laughing. But that everlasting smile stayed as always when she was around him. "What?" he exclaimed. "Your birthday is in a month and a half." She nodded. "Rainey, that's barely enough time for me to prepare. Oh, I should have asked you sooner. I'm so sorry, this is all my fault." "Sig, what are you talking about?" she questioned with a concerned expression. He sighed, pouting. "I'm talking about your birthday present. I was hoping I could make you something spectacular or something, but a month and a half isn't enough time for what I was thinking." "Oh, Sig, you don't have to get me anything. I'm okay, really," she assured him, but he shook his head. No. You deserve something amazing, marvelous, dazzling, spontaneous, and every other adjective that sounds as beautiful as you," he said. She blushed at the last part. "Sig, She held his hand and he looked up at her. "You've already given me everything I want and more. You've given me happiness and you. That is the best gift you could ever give me." His heart filled with love for her. As he looked into her mesmerizing eyes, he could feel how much he loved this girl who was once a stranger to him, this girl who was simply the girl who read across from him every day in the park, this girl who was beautiful but mysterious, this girl that he liked, and now, this girl that he loved. He knew exactly what he would do for her birthday. He was going to pour all his heart into her present. Hopefully, she would love it as much as he loved her. "Thank you, Rainey," he whispered, without taking his eyes off of her. A sweet smile spread across her lips, and his eyes followed the motion. Then he looked back into her eyes. She took in a deep breath and gulped, and slowly, hesitantly, she kissed him. He gently cupped her cheek while she tangled her fingers in his hair. It wasn't like their first kiss. It was even better. All their emotions were in that kiss. She could feel his love for her, and he could feel hers. They've never felt more connected to each other, more in love. When the moment was over, their happiness was still there. In each other's eyes, they knew the truth. No words were needed. In their hearts, they knew, without any "I love yous." "Buongiorno, Rainey. Come stai?" he slowly asked her, reciting the line he had been studying for her. She gave him a small smile, although it looked forced. "Bene, grazie. Are you sure?" He reached for her hand. She gazed down at their fingers, interlocked, and didn't answer him. "Rainey." He gently lifted her chin up to look into her eyes. Her eyes were filled with tears, one already rolling down her cheek. "Hey, don't cry. Come on." When he held her, she let herself break in his arms. She let her tears fall freely, and her feelings burst. Her knees went weak, but he grasped onto her. "Shh, it's okay. I got you," he whispered in her ear. "Sig," she cried, and he pulled back, holding her hands. "What's wrong, Rainey? You can tell me." She looked up at him, her lip quivering. "I'm tired, Sig. I'm so tired." "Of what?" "Everything," she sniffled. "I'm just tired, Sig." "Okay, beautiful. I understand. Come on." He sat down and gently placed her in his lap. Once they were in a comfortable position, she let out a sigh. "I'm sorry." He furrowed his eyebrows, confused. "For what?" "For crying on you." She smiled sheepishly. "You can cry on me any time. Just try to avoid snot, please," he joked, and she laughed. She wiped her tears from her cheeks and took in a deep breath. The afternoon light was shining perfectly on her face. He couldn't help but gaze at her beauty. "You're so beautiful, Rainey," he murmured, taking her by surprise. A chuckle escaped from her. "Even when I'm crying?" "Always," he replied, and her heart fluttered. A smile took over her face, as did his. Slowly but surely, she leaned towards him and pressed a kiss to his lips. He grinned, cupping her face as he returned the kiss. Their lips moved in sync and their hearts raced. It felt like they were in their own little world, practically breathing their happiness and love. Every single kiss between them was simply magical. They stopped to breathe, and he leaned his forehead on hers. She smiled when they locked eyes. "You're beautiful too," she said to him. He tilted his head back and laughed. "Thank you, Rainey." "You're welcome, Sig," she chuckled as he rubbed circles on her hands. He planted a small kiss on her forehead before they laid against each other again. They talked until the sun set and the moon appeared. Every time he was around, her insecurities and issues vanished. With each smile, her happiness grew, and their kisses only fueled their love. But when it was time to go home, when they had to separate and follow their own paths, when he was no longer with her, when he wasn't holding her hand or saying little things that made her heart throb, all of her happiness hid and her sadness returned. She wanted to scream and run back to him. She didn't want to feel pain. She didn't want to feel sad. She needed his love, but he didn't know, and she couldn't tell him, because it hurt. It hurt to say, especially to him. She was so tired. All she wanted was to be happy, with him. The sun was bright, the birds were singing, and his heart was still beating, for her. But where was she? Why was he alone at their park, at their spot? Why had he been alone without her for an entire week? Each day that week he had brought new Italian books and had learned many phrases for her. Whenever he was not wondering and worrying where she was, he practiced for her. He dreamt she would come back and he would recite everything he had learned. A beautiful smile would form on her face, brightening his day. He hoped and hoped, waited and waited, prayed and prayed. Yet she never appeared. And when he thought of all the petrifying possibilities of what was happening to her, he wept and wept. His heart would burn just thinking about her. Oh, how he longed for her, how he missed her. He missed her so much, it hurt. After an entire day of heartache, he'd reluctantly leave and make his way home, although she would never leave his mind. But today, he stopped at where they usually parted ways. He turned his head to his direction before turning to her direction. Moments passed as he stared blankly. In his mind, he was watching her leave him, hearing her soft footsteps on the sidewalk, the rustle of her clothing, all feelings of joy fading along with her, until she disappeared around the corner, into the night. If he had known that would be the last day he would see her, he would have walked home with her. He would have talked more with her. He would have made her laugh more, made her happier. Now, he was simply alone, with only the faint memories to comfort him. As he continued to stare, his heart thumped in his chest and his breath hitched. He couldn't handle it anymore. He couldn't wait any longer. So he walked, but not towards his home, towards hers. Slowly and steadily he went. His mind was like a whirlwind, just spinning and spinning. The closer he got to her house, the stronger he felt. He missed her so much. He missed her gorgeous smile, her gleeful laugh, her wise words, her warm hugs, her comforting eyes, and her heartwarming kisses. He needed her so badly. She made him happy, and without her he couldn't get that feeling. No one could make him feel that way except her. Every step he took was for her. His love for her gave him energy to keep walking, to never give up on her, and them. "I'm coming for you, Rainey, no matter what," he muttered under his breath. Then he was there, right in front of her house. The stone pathways which he had walked on with Rainey in his arms seemed bigger than before, but he ignored it and continued to her porch. At any moment, he felt as if the ground would swallow him whole. No matter how fast his heart beat, he wouldn't stop. Finally, he stepped up to her door and took in a deep breath. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Think of Rainey, think of Rainey," he repeated to himself while picturing her in his mind, and with renewed confidence, he knocked on the door thrice. Once again, he hoped and hoped, waited and waited, prayed and prayed, until a familiar woman opened the door. She furrowed her eyebrows. Hello there." Hi," he stuttered, and she stared at him, searching for any memory of him. "How can I help you?" she asked awkwardly. I'm looking for Rainey." "Rainey?" She wore a perplexed expression before gasping. "Whoa, wait, are you? No, wow, you must be. You're Sig." He rubbed the back of his neck, nodding. "Yeah, oh my, this is amazing. You're actually Sig." She smiled. "I've heard so many great things about you from my little sister. Nice to meet you. I'm Catherine," he exclaimed suddenly. "Yes, hi. It's so great to meet you. Rainey speaks very highly of you," he told her, and she grinned. "I knew she secretly loved me," she joked. He laughed. "Speaking of, where is she?" "What do you mean?" Her eyes widened. "You don't know?" "Know what?" She sighed before looking into his eyes solemnly. "Rainey is in the hospital." His eyes widened. It was as if the entire world stopped. What? Why?" Catherine sighed. "It's a long story. Please, Catherine, I need to know. She's my everything. She's all I got," he pleaded, his voice cracking. Catherine stared at him, searching his eyes. Then she nodded understandingly and gestured for him to come in the house. "Can you help me take this?" Catherine asked him, and he shakily took the large paper bag. He followed her back outside, waited for her to lock her house before walking with her to her car. Catherine opened the driver door and climbed in. He stood there awkwardly before she looked at him inside her car. "You want to see her, right?" He nodded and sat in the passenger seat. Before she began to drive, she put the paper bag in the back seats and gave him a small smile. It reminded him of her. "I'll explain everything on the way there," Catherine murmured before glancing at his tense figure. "Hey, Do you want to call anyone first to let them know where you are? It's pretty late." He shook his head. "No, and I don't have a phone anyways." "You could use mine," Catherine offered. "I meant what I said before. She's all I got," he replied, and she gave him a small smile before turning away. For a few minutes they stayed silent with only their thoughts. Then she spoke up. "Okay, let's start from the beginning." Catherine took in a deep breath. "Rainey, as you call her, was always a nice girl. She'd never purposely hurt someone's feelings, but when she did, she would apologize immediately. Because of that, people adored her. She was basically friends with everyone. But not only was she nice, she was intelligent too. She did so well in all of her classes that by the end of high school, she had been accepted into all of her chosen colleges. And she started right away," Catherine chuckled. "She was never one to waste time. Live in the moment, she'd say." He smiled a little at that. "Rainey told me she dropped out of college in her second year." Catherine nodded solemnly now, clutching the steering wheel. "Yeah, she did." "Why?" he asked reluctantly. Catherine kept her voice steady, but a tear had already escaped from her eyes. "Because she had been diagnosed with lymphoma cancer." And just like that, his heart shattered. Everything he had planned for them, gone. All he could think about was that she, the love and light of his life, had cancer. Why her? Why did it have to be her? She was such a good person, one of the best. What did she do to deserve this? "She can't." He held his face in his hands, breathing heavily. After 2 years of treatment and pain, she was in remission. She was good as new for 4 heavenly years. Until it came back last week, Catherine continued, her voice wavering. He looked over at her with tears in his eyes. "Why, Catherine? Why?" "I don't really know. The doctors said something about remaining cancer cells in her, but there's no actual cause for cancer recurrence." Catherine let out a humorless chuckle. "It's just all by fate, I guess. But she can do the treatments again, right? She could get better again, but for good, right?" he questioned desperately. "I won't lie to you, Sig. This is the second time she has lymphoma. There's not a very good chance." "No!" he cut her off. "No, she has to get better. I need her. I need Rainey. She can't just leave me." Catherine gulped in a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Sig." "No, only Rainey calls me that." "I'm so sorry," Catherine repeated as they got lost in their own feelings of grief. Soon after, Catherine had parked the car, but he didn't even notice. All the memories were replaying in his mind. He couldn't live with the fact that soon he wouldn't be able to make any new memories with her. One day, cancer will beat her in the race of life and she'll be gone. Just like that. "Hey, we're here." Catherine tapped his shoulder, but he didn't move at all. "I can't," he muttered as he stared blankly at the ground. Catherine sighed. "I know this is hard, but it's even harder for Rainey. That's why she needs you right now. Stop thinking of yourself and think of her. She's all you got, right?" "She's all I got," he nodded. Slowly, he stood up and followed her into the hospital. Catherine then helped him walk through the halls until they were in front of her room. "Are you ready?" He wiped his eyes with his sleeve before taking in a deep breath. "Would you mind giving us some time?" "Alone?" "Sure." Catherine smiled softly. "But remember, she needs you, more than ever now." "Yeah, me too." He waited for her to leave before closing his eyes and opening the door. He walked in the room and immediately found her beautiful face. "Rainey," he whispered, but she was sleeping. Careful not to wake her up, he sat beside her bed and stared at the tubes and the oxygen mask on her. The machine on the other side of her bed beeped for each heartbeat. She was still beautiful in his eyes, and she still owned his heart. "Oh, Rainey," he gently held her hand. "Please stay. I'll take care of you. I promise." She began to stir, her eyes fluttering open. "Sig?" "Rainey, yes, it's me. I'm here for you." He leaned closer to her and smiled. "How did you—" She trailed off, her eyebrows slightly furrowed. "Your sister, Catherine. I met her. She drove me here, Rainey." "Sig!" She cupped his cheek and smiled lightly. He brought her hand to his lips, then kissed it sweetly. He caressed her hand as he spoke. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, but I know everything now. It's going to be okay." "It is?" she asked him, and he swallowed his tears. "Yes, it is. You're going to be okay." She nodded and shifted closer to him. "Talk to me, Sig." "About what?" he whispered as they gazed at each other. "Anything. I just want to listen to you talk. I want to know that you're really here," she told him. "Well, okay, do you remember when you took care of me and fixed my ankle? How about before that? When you asked me to choose a number between 1 and 10. Remember that? I said 8 because it looks like the infinity sign if you turn it sideways, but what I didn't tell you was why I thought about the infinity sign," he began. "Rainy, you are the light at the end of a dark, dark tunnel for me. You helped me out of that tunnel with your kindness, generosity, beauty, and overall light, and I want that light you have to last forever. I want the happiness that you always give to me to last forever, but most of all, I want you to last forever. I want you to be my infinity." A bright smile spread across her face while he spoke. "Rainy," he continued, "when we first met at that park, I didn't think this was going to happen. I didn't think I would end up feeling this way for you. But I do, Rainy, every single day. I wake up and you're always the first thing on my mind." "You are too, Sig, always," she murmured. He grinned, holding both of her hands. "I don't know what better way to say this, but in Italian, sei il grande amore della mia vita, ti amo più di qualsiasi cosa, Rainy, sei il mio angelo, cara mia, ti voglio bene." She blinked. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Oh, I'm kidding. Sig, anch'io ti amo, asterisk, asterisk." She laughed, and he chuckled. "I really do love you," he whispered, before moving her oxygen mask and kissing her. "And I love you, Sig," she replied, before pulling away from the kiss. "Wait, hold up. I don't even know your real name," he laughed. "Well, it's kind of embarrassing." "Your name? Oh, come on, tell me please," she begged, and he sighed. It's Romeo." "Romeo? Like Romeo and Juliet?" Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? That kind of Romeo?" "Yes," he muttered monotonously. She let out a laugh. "I don't know why you're so embarrassed. It's cute. I love that name." "Well, what's your name?" He quirked an eyebrow at her. "My name, dear Romeo, is Ray." "Ray," he repeated, the name easily rolling off his tongue. He smirked. "Romeo and Ray. It sounds much better than Romeo and Juliet, doesn't it?" She smiled and he chuckled. "Much," he said before pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But only because you're my Juliet." She lovingly stroked his cheek. "And you're my Romeo." "I'd like you to meet my parents," Ray said as everyone gathered around her bed. "Mom, Dad, this is Sig, or at least that's what I call him. His real name is Romeo." They smiled. "Nice to meet you, Romeo. We're Deb and Lawrence." "I'm so happy I finally met you guys. You have a wonderful daughter," Romeo replied, which pleased them. "Kissing up to the future in-laws, huh? Smart move." Catherine winked at him and Ray laughed. Then she began coughing. "Here, honey." Deb handed her a cup of water. They all gave her worried looks. "I'm okay," Ray reassured, smiling. Deb touched her daughter's cheek before clearing her throat. I'm going to check in with your doctor. I'll be back." "Mum," Ray sighed, but she had already left. Catherine and Lawrence exchanged looks. "It's okay, Dad. Go after her." Catherine gestured between her and Romeo. "We got her." "Yeah," Romeo agreed while holding Ray's hand. Lawrence nodded at the both of them. "Thank you." After he left, Catherine and Romeo sat closer to Ray and the three of them made the best out of their situation. Their goal was to always keep Ray happy, at least in her last days. "You know you don't have to come every day, right? Ray understands that you have a life," Romeo cut her off. "No, I'm happy to be here. I want to be here. I'm not going to waste any day with her, Catherine." "Okay." Catherine smiled at him as they walked to Ray's room. "You're a good guy, Romeo. Good for my little sister." "Thank you. She's good for me too, more than good actually." They stopped in front of her room. The agonizing bawls coming out of the room broke their happy moods. "Rainy," Romeo murmured as he stared ahead. Catherine gulped. "I don't think you should go in there." But before she could finish her sentence, he had desperately rushed in the room. "Rainy!" Romeo yelled, watching her clutch her stomach in pain. A doctor tried to push him away. "Stop it! I love her! Let me be with her!" "Sir, she's in pain right now. She's having cramps due to swelling in her lymph nodes and she's itching all over. Let me take care of her," the doctor said, but Romeo wouldn't budge. Sig! Romeo, please!" Ray cried for him. "She needs me. Just let me be by her side, doctor, I beg you." The doctor sighed and nodded. Not missing a beat, Romeo ran to her side and held her hand. He tucked her hair back, searching her eyes. "Hey, baby, I'm here for you. It's okay. I got you." Romeo whispered softly, and she looked up at him, tears falling.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He kissed her forehead. No. I forgive you, Ray. Whatever it is. No, Romeo, she sobbed. I'm going to break your heart. I don't want to do that because I love you so much, but hey, I love you too. You're not going to break my heart. Ray shook her head, closing her eyes forcefully. I'm going to die and leave you all alone, and I'm going to be alone too. I'm sorry. Ray, he whispered. Don't say that. She let out a whimper before slowly lifting her head. His eyes widened. There was a long scar on her neck, stitched up by the doctors already. But what she did was still there. Romeo gasped quietly. I can't do this anymore, Sig. Not again. Remember when you said smoking was your slow suicide? Well, cancer is mine, but I don't want a slow suicide. I just want it to be over now. Rainey, I don't even smoke anymore. I stopped because of you. I love you more than anything. I'm not going to let you die like this. I promise you, Rainey, we are going to die together when we're old and wrinkly and toothless, okay? He told her, and she gazed into his eyes. Then she laughed. Okay, old and wrinkly and toothless it is. He grinned and pulled her to him. He kissed her with more love than he ever felt before, as did she. She held on to him, her hope and dreams right there in her arms. I love you, Sig. I love you, Rainey.